Time to light the match for the burning truth with Ben Dallas.
And welcome back to the set of the burning truth. I'd like to first thank our sponsors for this fabulous studio. Okay, that's the fine folks over at Target, Disney, Bud Light, and Dick's Sporting Goods. Now, in case you're wondering, no, I'm not actually Casey Hendrickson. So in case you don't know who Casey Hendrickson is, he's a syndicated RINO radio host. And he has a lot of people in this area in Michiana fooled. They think he's a real conservative. All he is a bought and paid for hack for the establishment GOP. Nothing more, nothing less. He's essentially a guy with zero beliefs that memorizes a set of lines to regurgitate to his audience. And he's pretty convincing. I used to call into his show all the time. Used to listen to him regularly. Unfortunately, as time went on, it became obvious that Casey was nothing more than a shill for Amy Drake, Jackie Horvath, and the rest of the establishment GOP. So I eventually started making videos about the guy. So he dedicated over 20 minutes to his show on attacking a member of the GOP, County Council member Dan Schaetzle. So what happened was, on the previous Saturday, on November 9th, Dan Schaetzle was at a monthly GOP party meeting. He was trying to defend himself from the woke right, Amy Drake, who just went up stage to attack him. So it's Dan's turn to speak. All of a sudden, the GOP gives him extra time constraints that he doesn't normally have when he speaks. And then Comrade Joe Lane, he's the vice chairman of the GOP, physically pushed him out of the way and took his microphone to shut him up. This is typically the kind of thing you see at Antifa events. So the goal of the radical left is to silence their opposition. They don't want to debate you. They don't want to actually have a discussion with you. They want to silence you. That's the exact same thing that the county GOP did to Dan Schaetzle. So in reaction to this, a few days later, Casey Hendrickson does a show where he spends like over 20 minutes bashing Dan Schaetzle for simply wanting to speak and defend himself. What I do find hilarious is this is the same Casey Hendrickson who previously 2 years ago defended incoming county council member Andy/Anthony Rutten when he got kicked out of a school board meeting for speaking over his allotted time.
All he's done, let's just say, when you watch the video, I mean, look, you can clearly see that Andy Rutten doesn't want to sit down and doesn't want to yield his time. So why did they treat him in a fashion that they do not treat other people? In other words, why aren't they enforcing the rules equally for everybody who speaks?
Well, that's a good question, Casey. So why didn't you ask that this time? Because I've personally been to those GOP meetings where elected officials spoke for over 10 minutes. In fact, I was at another GOP meeting where a non-elected official, Mark Rolfus, spent several minutes proposing to his girlfriend. That took several minutes. I didn't see his time get limited. I didn't see his microphone get snatched out of his hand. I didn't see him shoved as a result. Now check this out. Casey, in an attempt to gaslight his listeners, tries to pretend like he's the neutral observer. He's not on anybody's side. He's just putting both sides out there so you can know what's really going on. So Dan Schaetzle put out a newsletter after he got pushed, where he explained everything that happened. It was a pretty long newsletter. Casey decided to read that newsletter on air. Okay, great. Casey's whole premise is I'm going to read Dan's side of what happened, and then I'm going to give you the other side of what happened. The problem is this. He was so triggered by Dan's version of events, they had to keep redirecting his audience. I'm going to get through about half of Dan's newsletter that Casey was reading, and you'll see he already redirected his audience 8 times. He has to redirect his audience back to his narrative because he's so triggered, he's so enraged by Dan's version of events. Then immediately after that, Casey said, I'm going to give the other side. The other side is also Casey's side. So not only does he read Dan's version of events and then redirects it every couple of sentences, what you're watching is MSNBC or MSDNC on steroids because Casey is the other side. Literally. Then he gives you his whole version of events. He's the spokesperson for Amy Drake, Ashley Leader, Jackie Horvath, Joe Lane. That is their spokesman. So the leadership in the GOP that allowed this to happen, allowed an elected official to get assaulted, basically, pushed, and they shut him up in the middle of his speech. Okay, these people that let that happen, they actually did put out a version of their own side. They did in an email. It's right here. Now, what's truly mind-boggling, even for Casey being a syndicated RINO, is that he picked and chose what he wanted to read. He only read Dan's email. Then, of course, he interjected himself every 2 sentences. But he didn't even read the actual response from the other side. Instead, he just made it his own response and pretended it was from the other side. So Casey has this weak, feeble argument that he keeps trying to push onto people. He keeps trying to pretend that people on both factions of the GOP are trying to pull him to put him on their side. When the reality is, he's already on a side. He's been on the same side the entire time. He's not very influential. He's not very talented. And all he really does is piggyback off of other people's work and try to pass it along like he's somehow involved in that work. Take Real News Michiana, for example. At one point during his rant, he referred to Real News Michiana as Real Antifa Michiana, forgetting the fact that he had been on Fox News a couple different occasions pushing articles that were put out by Real News Michiana. Again, he pretended he had something to do with the news story, but he didn't. He was just piggybacking off of somebody else's work because that's what he does best. Now, enjoy this compilation of Casey reading Dan Schaetzle's side of the story. It's a long response, okay? We don't have all day. What I cut to was every time that Casey wanted to interject during Dan's response on his email, because that's important. What you get to see is how he keeps trying to shift and mold the discussion back to his narrative, making it obvious that all he does is carry water for the establishment right. Enjoy.
It's like needless information, but actually kind of glad he put it in there because it kind of provides some context for what actually happened. Okay, I was going to do a sidebar, I was going to say some family, but I digress. I will explain their position on why that is here in just a minute. Which didn't happen. There was a altercation with his brother, but turns out the early reports about the hulking, tearing off the shirt, physical assault with a chair over his head was a lie. Let's see. So he's basically saying, I didn't support the incumbent. I supported my friend who was running against him in the primary. That's what he's saying. Okay. Which is weird because there's a lot of inaccuracies in them, but I haven't addressed them on the show. Mike Mish is the Democrat lawyer who pretended to be a Republican, had a lot of influence in the St. Joseph County Republican Party, has pushed a lot of the, frankly, nonsense that has been happening in the GOP since Zach passed away, and has recently been exposed. And now is no longer in a position of authority with the Republican Party in St. Joseph County. And frankly, there's a lot of people that he's got his grubby little pocketbook fingers in that don't like that. John, can I ask you another question before we go to commercial break on air, please?
Hi, I'm John Zimney from 95.3 MNC, and I agree with everything Casey says all the time.
I'm not going to put you on the spot, I promise. You have borne witness to me being lied about repeatedly over the past year and a half or so.
Mm-hmm.
Have I ever showed up anywhere and just started screaming and yelling at anybody over it?
No.
I don't even think I've even mentioned it on the show.
I'm
really.
pretty quiet about it.
I've been pretty quiet about it. It's, so that's where we will pick it up. And then I will tell you the other side.
Definitely a neutral observer. Don't let anybody tell you any different.
There's a time limit when you give those speeches, by the way. Like, you don't have like a free time unless you're a special featured person. Otherwise, you'd never leave.
Right. That's why almost everyone breaks their time limit every single month. And this is the first time a time limit has actually been enforced. I'm just so glad that we get the burning truth to put us on the right track so we know what really happened.
And he would not yield. Now, Joe Lane is up there. So you got the three people. You got two women. You got Joe Lane. Joe Lane runs these meetings. He's the one guy. So I don't, what do? You just let him continue to violate the rules, continue to talk? Do you, beg and plead with him? He's already said no, and he's going to continue to go. Or do you remove the microphone from him? Joe Lane's decision was to remove the microphone. At that point, Dan resisted. Dan didn't put in here that he resisted, but he resisted the microphone being given back to Joe Lane, which then led to a shove.
He resisted because Comrade Joe Lane is apparently a very important guy. I'm sorry, Casey, but who the fuck is Joe Lane? Joe Lane is nobody. Joe Lane is a loser. He has no right to put his hands on someone and to force them to stop speaking, especially when this happens repetitively every single meeting, every single month. Casey, you're full of shit. As I showed earlier, you're okay with people speaking over their time if there's already a precedent for that happening, like you brought up yourself with Andy/Anthony Rutten. You were a hypocrite and a pathological liar. Also, one more thing before I go. Casey, anytime there's a tragedy, like a school shooting or something like that, you always try to invoke your previous status of being in the military. You say, well, I'm a veteran. Because of my time in the military, I understand tactical procedures and blah, blah, blah. Casey, once again, you're full of shit. Yes, you're in the Army, technically, but you never deployed, right? So you got out before 2001, or around that time frame. So you never been to Iraq, you never been to Afghanistan, you never deployed, you never did anything tactical in your life, but yet you keep repeating that you're some kind of tactical expert when it comes to police maneuvers or military strategy and so on. You're full of shit. You know nothing. You've done nothing. You have zero experience. You know nothing more about any type of tactical techniques that police officers in the military use than your listeners that are hearing your show. So just stop with the nonsense. You're a fake. You're a phony. Most people know it, but some don't. And I was fooled for a while myself. So you're kind of acting like Tim Walz a little bit with your military record. Dude, just knock it off. Nobody believes you. You're full of shit. Go away.
La 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 la, la 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 la. Casey's World.